Hello viewers, and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Buckeye State, Ohio. Ohio is a state of many firsts in this country. It gave us the first traffic light, the first police car, the first fire department, and most importantly, the first hot dog. Ohio has the only non-rectangular shaped state flag. It is a more pennant shape, seen here. And I did learn about another weird law coming from Ohio this time. It is illegal to hunt for whales on a Sunday. Apparently any other day of the week it's okay to hunt whales. I don't know where in Ohio you would go hunting for whales. I don't know if there are whales in Lake Erie. I very much doubt it. But anyway, the law is very clear on that point. No whaling on Sunday, okay? Ohio has 16 congressional House districts, and the current balance of power is 12 Republicans to 4 Democrats. Of those 16 districts, there are 2 that I consider to be competitive, somewhat competitive this year, and they are Ohio's 1st and 12th highlighted up here. They cover many suburban areas of Cincinnati and Columbus, respectively. And they have ratings of +5 into the Republican column and +7 into the Republican column, respectively, according to the Cook Political Reports Partisan Voting Index when compared to the national average. Republican Steve Chabot of Ohio's 1st District won his 5th term in 2018 by about a 4% margin of victory. This occurred, of course, during the big blue wave of 2018, which largely looked past Ohio for the most part. I mean, he did win it in 2016 by about 18%, so it was about a 14% shift to the left. But as we'll get into a little later, the way Ohio's districts are drawn make it pretty difficult for seats to flip, even in partisan wave years. There's a somewhat similar story for Ohio's 12th district as well. Current Republican Representative Troy Balderson won his first full term in 2018 by about a 4 to 4.5% margin of victory, and that was diminished from the Republicans' margin of victory in 2016 in the district by 33%, signifying a massive shift to the left in the suburbs surrounding Ohio's largest city and capital, Columbus. Let's gain some more insight about how citizens of Ohio have been voting for their representatives by pulling up a line graph right now. And looking here, we do see pretty competitive at the elections at the state level indeed. We do have those expected peaks and dips in presidential years versus midterm years, respectively, with Republicans maintaining a pretty consistent advantage going back over the past decade. 2012 was, of course, the year that Barack Obama carried the state of Ohio by about 3% margin of victory, I believe. And so he outperformed Democrats running statewide in all the House districts around Ohio by a small margin. Then in the following year, 2014, when Republicans just had great turnout for their candidates running for Congress that year, we see a larger separation favoring Republicans. And then again, an even larger separation in 2016. Of course, we'll get into this in the next section, but Donald Trump was able to carry Ohio pretty comfortably 4 years ago, and that's kind of largely reflected in the raw House turnout numbers as well. But then when we looked at 2018, we see that gap closing significantly. That's part of that blue wave I was talking about earlier. Republicans fell off not quite down to 2014 or 2010 levels, but they did fall off more significantly than Democrats did going from 2016 to 2018. But that wasn't enough for any districts to flip in Ohio 2 years ago. They all remained in their respective parties' control after the 2018 results came in. Although, as I've mentioned, there were some massive shifts to the left in more suburban districts, the 1st and the 12th, that are considered competitive this year. Okay, let's toss that graph aside. Considering a few things, I don't think either the 1st or the 12th is going to flip this year either. I imagine they will both remain in Republicans' control this November, and that's largely due to the fact that Republicans stayed pretty competitive in 2018. Even when Democrats showed up in massive numbers, Republicans still were able to hold out their edge in just raw turnout numbers. Also, let's take a moment to look at what some of the districts look like in Ohio. When you have districts in a state that look like this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, it becomes really difficult to mix up the party breakdown of a state's districts when they're drawn so strategically to remain in their respective columns. Of course, this is a practice known as gerrymandering. Many of these districts are drawn in ways where they are able to lump together a lot of more Democratic-leaning households into the same district, and then a lot of Republican-leaning households into the same district, so that no matter what the tide of the country is looking like, these would be the last districts to flip. That's why I think Ohio's 1st and 12th are unlikely to flip this year. They will be close. I think they'll be around 5, maybe a little less than 5% margins of victory for both candidates. But at the end of the day, there is no change in the makeup of the House. in Ohio as projected by us, me and Polbot. So let's make that official and put it on our first map right now. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. Ohio is a state that has voted for the winning presidential candidate every year, going all the way back to 1964. This is the longest continuous streak, winning streak for any state in the country. The last time they voted for the loser of the presidential race was in 1960 when they elected Richard Nixon over John F. Kennedy. So naturally, a lot of pollsters and election predictors look to Ohio early on to see how it's trending, to maybe try to get a feel of how the electorate of the country as a whole is looking. But as we'll get into in a little bit, that might not be as reliable a factor going into future elections. Trump's victory in Ohio in 2016 wasn't even particularly close. He won the state by about 8% over Hillary Clinton. This was an 11-point swing to the right after Barack Obama had previously won Ohio over Mitt Romney in 2012 by about 3%. Ohio has truly been living up to its reputation as a swing state in recent elections. To get a closer understanding of how Ohioans have been voting for presidential candidates recently, let's pull up some voter turnout ratios right now. And here we're seeing some numbers that actually had me double check them once I first calculated them. We see a clear advantage in 2012 for Barack Obama over Mitt Romney. He enjoyed roughly 16 percentage points more in his presidential to House voter ratio that year, meaning that he received 17.25% more votes than every Democratic House candidate running for the state as a Democrat in Ohio that year, whereas Mitt Romney received almost exactly the same amount of votes as all Republican House candidates running in Ohio that year. And then going to 2016, we see those numbers drop off for both parties, both candidates. So Hillary Clinton performed worse than Barack Obama in terms of ratio, and Donald Trump performed worse than Mitt Romney by about the same amount as Hillary Clinton did relative to Barack Obama. So that begs the question, okay, how did Donald Trump carry the state of Ohio by 8% when he had a value below Hillary Clinton by about 17 percentage points? The reason for that is because these values are relative to raw House turnout numbers, which, if you'll remember from the previous section, was great for Republicans in 2016. It's my belief that many Ohioans did not consider the race to be particularly competitive at the presidential level 4 years ago. Hillary Clinton may have been considered a shoo-in by many of the Democratic voters of the state, and those would-be voters did not show up in large enough numbers to keep the state competitive for the two candidates, and at the end of the day, you had Donald Trump carrying the state pretty significantly. I believe turnout is going to be higher this year in Ohio because many voters have probably snapped out of that complacency at this point, but anyway, let's toss those numbers aside, and to predict how this could possibly go down in Ohio this year, we have to lastly consider the approval rating of the incumbent. In this case, it is President Trump. He is currently at -3 approval points in the state of Ohio, which is pretty, it's almost zero. It's pretty close. He has the approval of 47% of voters and the disapproval of 50%. So the things working for Trump this time around are the pretty consistently larger turnout numbers for Republicans at the House level. Working against him is that slightly below zero approval rating and his slight disadvantage in those voter turnout ratios. So this is, make no mistake, Ohio is truly a swing state. It has been for decades, and it's likely going to be this year as well. So, but anyway, let's give everything that we know so far to Polbot here to calculate who could possibly win Ohio this November. Joe Biden, Donald Trump. Polbot? And there's your result. We have projected Donald Trump to carry the state of Ohio for a second time this year, but by only 2.95% margin. This would be a shift to the left in the state of Ohio by about 5%. The reason for this projected shift leftward is likely due to Democrats' larger than expected turnout numbers at the House level in 2018 that really drove up projected numbers for 2020. But at the end of the day, we do see Republicans in the state remaining competitive at the state level, and I do believe they're going to be able to carry Donald Trump to bring Donald Trump the 18 Electoral College votes from Ohio for a second time this year. This would normally be a death sentence for the losing candidate when it comes to the presidential race in Ohio, but I do believe changing demographics are going to pull that responsibility away from Ohio going into the future. But 18 Electoral College votes is a significant amount of votes to have in your corner, so that's good news for Donald Trump. Now, let's make this result official and put it on our presidential map right now. Mark it. So now all the election results are in for Ohio. We've seen a Republican presidential candidate winning for a second time. We've also seen no flips in the House, although we have seen at the state level a pretty noticeable shift to the left since 2016. Let's take a moment to talk briefly about the future of Ohio by pulling up an old line graph and a new one as well. First, let's take a bit of a closer look at these raw House turnout numbers at the House level for Ohio. Let's look specifically at those slope values that we can see for both of those equations there. For Republicans, it's that value preceding X, that 85.2, and for Democrats, it's that value 68.7. Basically, what those numbers are telling us is that on average, when you look at the last decade as a whole, every 2 years, Republicans have been gaining 85,200 votes more every 2 years for their candidates versus 68,700 votes for Democratic House candidates every 2 years. So ultimately, we see Republicans still breaking away from Democrats at an average of just under 17,000 raw votes for House candidates every 2 years. The reason those slope values are competitive at all is because of that blue wave we saw in 2018. Here, where you can see that Democrat numbers barely dropped off at all from 2016 going into 2018. And yet still there were a lot of Republicans that turned out that year. They still outvoted Democrats and turned out in greater numbers than they had in previous midterm cycles this past decade, signifying that the state is not necessarily becoming more Democrat after the big blue wave of 2018. And next, let's take a look at this other line graph I've cooked up for you here. These lines are basically estimated rates of decrease for presidential to House voter ratios, those numbers that I was using in my calculations earlier. And we see negative slopes for both parties here, and they're decreasing at a rate nearly identical to each other, with Democrats holding a pretty consistent edge over the last 10 years. Basically, voters in Ohio that vote for Democratic House candidates had more enthusiasm for Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton relative to their House candidate. The case is the opposite for Republicans, where their enthusiasm for their presidential candidate was either equal to or less than their enthusiasm for their chosen House candidate. This is a factor that plays into Democrats' favor looking ahead, but as we've projected here today, is not quite enough for Biden to carry the state this year, although Democrats are projected to be able to shift the state leftward by about 5 percentage points, which could be interpreted as good news for Ohio Democrats looking ahead. But I think it goes a little deeper than that. So let's toss those graphs aside, and I will give you my final consensus on Ohio. I believe Ohio has already begun to become more Republican and is going to continue to do so for the near future anyway. The state was largely unaffected by the blue wave in the way that other states were. In some other states we've covered in this series so far, we saw Democrats actually outperforming Republicans for the first time in years at the House level. That's not the case in Ohio here. Republicans were able to remain competitive, and because of that, they were able to hold on to all 12 of their seats in the House of Representatives. Ohio is a state that is not growing at a rate that many other states are, particularly in the West and the Sun Belt and the South. The state actually stands to lose some electoral college votes after this current census is completed, and I do believe that'll play into Republicans' favor going into the future. Ohio may no longer be the bellwether state of this country if it makes a dramatic shift to the right, as I imagine it very possibly could. And that just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting. See you next time.